April 19th, 1945. The volcanic ash of Okinawa clung to everything. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell of Company A, 193rd Tank Battalion, sat in his OM-4 Sherman, sweat mixing with the black grit that coated his face. Through the periscope, he watched the jagged ridges ahead, knowing that somewhere in those coral formations Japanese gunners were waiting. What Mitchell didn't know was that one of those gunners, Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto, was crouched behind a Type 1 47mm anti-tank gun, his hands steady on the breech mechanism despite the thunder of American naval bombardment shaking the earth around him. Yamamoto had been trained to wait, to hold fire until the Shermans were close enough that even his inadequate weapon might have a chance. The Type 1 represented Japan's desperate attempt to create an indigenous anti-tank gun capable of stopping modern armour. But by the time it saw combat in 1943, it was already obsolete against the very tanks it had been designed to destroy. This is the story of how Japan's best anti-tank gun tried and ultimately failed to stem the tide of American armour in the Pacific, a tale of industrial limitations, tactical improvisation, and the crushing reality that courage and determination could not compensate for technological inferiority. The story of the Type 1 begins not with triumph, but with humiliation. In the summer of 1939, along the disputed border between Mongolia and Manchuria, near a small village called Nomonhan, the Imperial Japanese Army received a brutal education in modern armoured warfare. The Nomonhan Incident, as the Japanese called it, or the Battles of Khalkhin Gol as the Soviets knew it, became a turning point in Japanese military thinking about anti-tank capabilities. The 23rd Infantry Division, relatively green and poorly equipped, faced a Soviet force that would eventually include 498 armoured vehicles and overwhelming artillery support. When Soviet commander Gyorgy Zhukov launched his offensive on August 20, 1939, Japanese positions were hammered by 150 bombers and massed artillery before Soviet armour swept around the flanks in a classic double envelopment. The Japanese defenders, armed primarily with the Type 94 37mm anti-tank gun, discovered to their horror that their weapons were woefully inadequate against Soviet BT tanks and the heavier T-26 models. The Type 94, introduced in 1936, had seemed adequate when fighting Chinese forces with minimal armour, but against Soviet tanks with proper armour protection, it was nearly useless. Japanese gunners watched in despair as their armour-piercing rounds bounced off Soviet hulls or penetrated without causing catastrophic damage. By the time the fighting ended on August 31st, the Japanese Sixth Army had lost between 18,000 and 23,000 men. The Kwantung Army had lost nearly 150 aircraft and many of its tanks and artillery pieces. More importantly, Japan had lost its confidence in its anti-tank capabilities. In the post-battle analysis, Japanese officers submitted damning reports. The Type 94's short bore, low muzzle velocity of around 730 meters per second, and limited penetration made it obsolete against any modern tank. At 500 meters, it could barely penetrate 25 millimeters of steel, insufficient against even medium tanks of the late 1930s. The semi-automatic breech mechanism was clever, allowing trained crews to fire up to 30 rounds per minute, but volume of fire meant nothing if the rounds couldn't penetrate the target. Japanese Army High Command faced an uncomfortable truth. They had assumed they would primarily face Chinese forces with minimal armour, or at most light tanks from Western powers. Nomonhan proved that assumption catastrophic. In late 1939, as Europe descended into war and Japan remained mired in China, the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff authorized development of a new anti-tank gun. The requirements were specific, but reflected Japan's strategic miscalculations. The weapon needed to defeat light and medium tanks, be light enough for rapid deployment with infantry units, and be manufacturable with Japan's limited industrial capacity. The first prototype, designated the experimental Type 97 47mm anti-tank gun, appeared between 1938 and 1939. It weighed 567 kilograms and featured a barrel length of 2,515mm, giving it an L53.7 designation. The muzzle velocity reached 730 meters per second, a significant improvement over the Type 94. Testing began in March 1939, focusing on mobility and ballistics. The gun could be towed by trucks or broken down for horse transport, reflecting Japan's mixed motorization. By November, ballistics tests showed promising results. The 47mm caliber was chosen as a compromise. Larger calibers would have been more effective, but would require more steel, more propellant, and heavier carriages that Japan's limited truck fleet couldn't easily tow. The 47mm round offered reasonable penetration with manageable weight and recoil. Engineers at the Osaka arsenal, assigned to refine the design, incorporated several advanced features. The gun used a semi-automatic horizontal sliding wedge breech mechanism, an improvement over earlier designs. When fired, the recoil action automatically opened the breech and ejected the spent cartridge. Loading a fresh round automatically closed the breech, allowing sustained fire rates of approximately 15 rounds per minute with a trained crew. The carriage featured a split trail design that opened to 60 degrees, providing a stable firing platform. The trails could be closed for travel, and the entire weapon could be towed at reasonable speeds by Type 94 trucks or broken down into pack loads for horse transport. The suspension system used independently sprung wheels with pneumatic tyres, a relatively modern feature that improved cross-country mobility. The gun shield was simple, a flat plate designed to protect the crew from small arms fire and shell fragments. Unlike German or American designs with angled shields, the Type 1's flat shield reflected Japan's focus on production simplicity over maximum protection. As with many Japanese weapons, the Type 1 had an extremely low profile, allowing it to be operated from kneeling or prone positions. This design philosophy emphasized concealment over crew comfort, expecting gunners to fight from camouflage positions and rely on surprise rather than sustained firefights. The gun was officially accepted into service in 1941, designated Type 1 for the Imperial year 2601. Actual production began in 1942 at the Osaka arsenal. The timing was significant. By 1942, tank design had advanced considerably from the late 1930s. The German Wehrmacht was fielding Panzerthaukers with upgraded guns, the Soviets were producing T-34s with sloped armour, and the Americans were manufacturing thousands of M4 Shermans. The Type 1 was designed to fight tanks from 1939. By the time it reached frontline units, it was already marginal against current armour. The production numbers tell a story of Japan's industrial limitations. Approximately 2,300 Type 1 guns were manufactured between 1942 and 1945. For comparison, Germany produced over 20,000 Pat-40 75mm anti-tank guns during a similar period. The United States manufactured more than 15,000 57mm anti-tank guns. Japan's entire war production of its primary anti-tank weapon roughly equaled what other nations produced in a few months. This reflected broader industrial constraints. Japan had prioritized naval construction and aircraft production, diverting steel and manufacturing capacity away from ground weapons. By 1944, with shipping routes severed and raw material imports cut off, even maintaining existing production rates became impossible. The Type 1 specifications on paper seemed reasonable. Total weight was approximately 753 kilograms, light enough for truck towing. The barrel measured 2,130mm with an L53.7 ratio. Maximum traverse was 60 degrees, elevation ranged from -11 to +19 degrees, and muzzle velocity reached 823 meters per second with armor-piercing shells. Penetration figures varied with ammunition type. The standard Type 1 armor-piercing high-explosive round could penetrate 55mm of armor at 100 meters, 40mm at 500 meters, and 30mm at 1,000 meters. These numbers meant the gun could theoretically defeat light tanks and older medium tanks at close range, but struggled against modern armor. The M4 Sherman presented a particular problem. The Sherman's frontal hull armor was 50.8mm thick, but set at a 56-degree angle, giving effective thickness of over 90mm. The turret front was similarly protected. The Type 1 could not penetrate Sherman frontal armor at any practical combat range. The Sherman's side armor was 38mm, which the Type 1 could penetrate at ranges exceeding 700 meters, but hitting a tank's side required careful positioning and often suicidal exposure. Japanese tactical doctrine evolved to compensate. Guns were positioned in camouflaged, often underground positions covering likely tank approaches. Crews were trained to hold fire until tanks presented side shots, preferably at ranges under 200 meters where penetration was assured. Multiple guns would target single tanks, concentrating fire to increase hit probability. This defensive doctrine worked occasionally but required perfect conditions. The Type 1 first saw significant combat in 1943 in the Southwest Pacific. On Tarawa in November 1943, a handful of Type 1 guns were positioned to cover beach approaches. The guns were well camouflaged and had excellent fields of fire, but the overwhelming American bombardment destroyed most positions before the tanks even landed. Those guns that survived managed to knock out several Sherman tanks by hitting them in the sides and rear as they manoeuvred through the limited terrain. American after-action reports noted the Type 1 as an excellent weapon, with high muzzle velocity that proved most effective in combat, though not always available in sufficient numbers. On Peleliu in September 1944, the Type 1 demonstrated both its potential and limitations. The island's defender, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had studied American tactics and developed a defense in depth that avoided beach fighting in favor of prolonged resistance from prepared positions. Type 1 guns were positioned in coral caves and camouflaged bunkers overlooking tank approaches. The battle began September 15th. As Marines of the 1st Marine Division advanced inland, they encountered a 30-foot coral ridge known as the Point. A 47mm gun, likely a Type 1, pounded the Marines continuously from a fortified position. Company K, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines took heavy casualties trying to silence the gun, which remained in action for hours despite repeated assaults. This engagement typified the Type 1's effectiveness when properly employed. The gun's low profile and camouflage made it nearly impossible to spot until it fired. The high rate of fire allowed crews to engage multiple targets quickly. The semi-automatic breach meant rapid follow-up shots. But once identified, American tanks and artillery quickly suppressed or destroyed the position. Japanese gunners died with their weapons, having inflicted casualties but unable to stop the American advance. The true test came at Okinawa, April through June 1945. The 32nd Japanese Army under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima had over 75,000 troops and the most sophisticated defensive positions Japan had yet constructed in the Pacific. Multiple Type 1 guns were integrated into layered defences, covering every approach to Japanese strongpoints. April 19, 1945 saw one of the most costly American armoured engagements in the Pacific. The 27th Infantry Division attempted to break through Japanese defences around Kakazu Ridge. Tank infantry teams advanced across open ground directly into prepared Japanese positions. The disaster unfolded rapidly. Multiple Type 1 guns, positioned in underground bunkers and cave positions, opened fire simultaneously. 4 Sherman tanks from Company A, 193rd Tank Battalion, were knocked out by a single gun position before it could be identified and destroyed. The gun crew had waited until the tanks were within 150 metres, presenting side shots as they manoeuvred around terrain obstacles. At that range, the Type 1's armour-piercing rounds penetrated easily, setting tanks ablaze and killing crews. Throughout the day, American tanks took devastating losses. One after-action report noted that a single Type 1 gun held up the entire 193rd Tank Battalion for an entire day, destroying 4 tanks before being silenced. The battle demonstrated that while the Type 1 couldn't match Sherman armour in direct engagement, properly positioned guns with disciplined crews could inflict serious damage. American tankers developed specific tactics to counter the Type 1 threat. Reconnaissance became crucial. Infantry would scout ahead, trying to identify gun positions before tanks advanced. Artillery and naval gunfire would saturate suspected positions. Tanks would advance with infantry support, the infantry suppressing gun positions with small arms and grenades while tanks manoeuvred. Tank crews learned to watch for the Type 1's distinctive muzzle flash and immediately engage with high explosive rounds and machine gun fire. The confined spaces where Type 1 guns were typically positioned made them vulnerable to concussion and fragmentation. Flamethrower tanks became particularly effective, their napalm streams reaching into caves and bunkers where conventional weapons struggled. One engagement at Sugarloaf Hill in May 1945 illustrated the evolving counter-tactics. American forces had located several Type 1 positions covering the approaches. Rather than direct assault, they coordinated a massive artillery barrage followed by airstrikes with napalm and bombs. Flamethrower tanks then advanced with infantry support, systematically burning out each position. The Type 1 guns were never able to fire effectively, their crews killed or forced to abandon their positions. This represented the fundamental problem. The Type 1 was a competent weapon when employed from prepared positions with surprise on its side, but it couldn't sustain combat against an enemy with overwhelming firepower and the resources to methodically reduce defensive positions. The gun's use in tank-mounted form provided an interesting comparison. A variant called the Type 1 47mm tank gun was developed for several Japanese tanks, including the Type 97 Chiha Shinhoto and the Type 1 Chihi medium tanks. The tank gun used the same ammunition as the anti-tank gun but had slightly reduced performance due to a shorter barrel and different mounting. Japanese tankers discovered what anti-tank gunners already knew. The gun was adequate against light tanks and in ambush situations but hopelessly outmatched in direct combat against Shermans. The few tank versus tank engagements in the Pacific were one-sided disasters. The Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate Japanese tank armour at any combat range, while Japanese guns struggled to damage Sherman fronts even at point-blank range. One documented engagement at Tarawa involved a Type 97 Chiha Shinhoto, armed with a Type 1 tank gun, attempting to engage Marine Shermans. The Japanese tank fired multiple rounds that bounced off the Sherman's frontal armour, the American tankers not even realising they were under fire initially. When the Sherman crew identified the threat and returned fire, their 75mm high-explosive round struck the Chiha's turret, and the Japanese tank literally disintegrated, its thin armour providing no protection against the massive American shell. This disparity extended to industrial capacity. A Sherman tank required approximately 10,000 man-hours to build and used advanced manufacturing techniques, including welded construction and cast armour. The Chiha required fewer resources, but still represented a significant investment for Japan's limited production capacity. By 1945, Japan was manufacturing perhaps 50 tanks per month. The United States was producing over 2,000 Shermans monthly. Even if Japanese tanks had been qualitatively equal, which they were not, the quantitative disparity made defeat inevitable. Japanese crews did everything possible to compensate for material inferiority. Tactics emphasized ambush, concealment, and fighting from positions where retreat was impossible. Type 1 guns were positioned in bunkers with overhead cover, sometimes with multiple feet of earth and logs to withstand bombardment. Fields of fire were carefully calculated to catch tanks in vulnerable angles. Crews were trained to target specific areas, the tracks to immobilize, the sides to penetrate, the engine deck if possible. But these tactics required perfect execution and usually meant crew death. American tankers learned to identify likely gun positions and saturate them with fire before closing. The Sherman's multiple machine guns could suppress bunker openings, while the 75mm gun demolished fortifications with high explosive rounds. Support infantry would clear positions with grenades and flamethrowers. The Type 1's low rate of fire compared to American automatic weapons meant Japanese crews often couldn't suppress attacking infantry while targeting tanks. The most desperate attempts to counter American armour didn't involve guns at all. By late 1944, Japan was fielding suicide anti-tank weapons. The Shitotsubakurai lunge mine consisted of a conical hollow charge on a wooden pole. A soldier would run at a tank and thrust the mine against the armour. The charge would detonate, theoretically penetrating the armour and killing the user instantly. It was issued in 1945 as a last-ditch weapon. American reports noted that all attempts to use lunge mines had failed. Tank crews were prepared for such tactics, using hand grenades thrown ahead of their tanks into likely hiding spots, and machine gunning any Japanese soldier brave or foolish enough to charge their position. The lunge mine represented the ultimate admission of Japanese anti-tank failure. When your doctrine requires soldiers to kill themselves just to have a chance of disabling enemy armour, you've lost not just the technological battle, but the war itself. Other suicide methods included magnetic mines, satchel charges, and even soldiers diving under tank tracks while wearing explosive vests. All were variations on the same theme. Japan lacked effective anti-tank weapons, so they substituted human sacrifice. It was tactically ineffective and strategically bankrupt. Each Japanese soldier who died attempting to destroy a tank was irreplaceable. Each Sherman that was damaged or destroyed was replaced within days, often hours, from the vast American production apparatus. The broader context of Japanese anti-tank warfare reveals systematic failure across multiple areas. Artillery was pressed into anti-tank roles, The Type 90 75mm field gun had reasonable anti-tank capability with its high muzzle velocity, but it was a heavy weapon designed for indirect fire support. Deploying it in direct fire anti-tank roles exposed it to counter-battery fire and reduced the artillery support available to infantry. The 70mm battalion gun and various other weapons were similarly misused. Mines were available, but never in sufficient quantities. Japanese mine production was limited, and the types produced were often improvised or obsolete designs. American tanks equipped with mine rollers or following engineer clearance teams could usually breach minefields without excessive losses. Doctrine emphasized human wave attacks and infiltration tactics that had worked against Chinese forces but proved suicidal against American firepower. The famous Banzai charges that occurred on Attu, Saipan and other islands resulted in horrific Japanese casualties without meaningful impact on American forces. When thousands of men armed with rifles and bayonets charge positions defended by machine guns, tanks and artillery, the result is massacre. These tactical failures reflected strategic delusions at the highest levels of Japanese command. Military leaders believed that superior Japanese fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. This Bushido mythology held that Japanese soldiers, willing to die for the emperor, were superior to Western soldiers focused on self-preservation. The reality was that courage, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice were universal among combat troops. What wasn't universal was industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and logistical capability. The United States could manufacture, transport, and support millions of tons of war material. Japan couldn't. Spirit couldn't overcome that disparity. As the war progressed and American forces closed on the Japanese home islands, the Type 1 became less and less relevant. By 1945, most guns were emplaced in fixed positions defending likely invasion beaches. With no possibility of offensive operations, the guns sat in concrete bunkers and waited for an invasion that never came. In the few places where Type 1 guns remained in mobile service, they achieved occasional successes against isolated American units. In the Philippines, several Type 1 guns ambushed American armor columns, destroying multiple vehicles before being overwhelmed. On Iwo Jima, guns positioned in the volcanic caves managed to hit several landing vehicles and tanks during the initial assault. But these were pinpricks against the American juggernaut. For every tank destroyed, 10 more came ashore. For every gun crew that fought to the death, American production replaced the losses within hours. After the war, captured Type 1 guns were examined by American and British intelligence. Technical evaluations were surprisingly positive about the gun's mechanical design. The semi-automatic breech was well engineered. The carriage was robust and mobile. The sights were adequate. The problems were fundamental and insurmountable. The caliber was too small for modern warfare. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce sufficient numbers. Ammunition production was limited by raw material shortages. Most importantly, the doctrine of static defense from fixed positions negated mobility advantages and ensured guns would be destroyed by overwhelming firepower before they could significantly impact American operations. One evaluation noted that the Type 1 would have been an excellent weapon if introduced in 1938 and produced in quantities of 20,000 or more. By 1943, facing Sherman tanks with skilled crews and massive fire support, it was marginal at best. The report concluded that Japanese anti-tank capabilities were inadequate to meaningfully resist American armor, and that no amount of tactical skill or individual bravery could compensate for the technological and industrial gap. The human cost of this inadequacy was staggering. Japanese anti-tank crews died by the thousands, fighting with weapons they knew were insufficient, in positions they knew were doomed for a cause that was already lost. Corporal Yamamoto, whom we met at the beginning, was one of thousands. On April 19th, his gun fired 4 rounds at approaching Shermans, managing one hit that damaged but didn't disable the target. American artillery identified his muzzle flash, and within minutes, high explosive shells collapsed his bunker, killing him and his crew instantly. His gun was never recovered, buried under tons of coral and earth. Individual stories emerged from prisoner interrogations and captured documents. One Type 1 crew on Okinawa held a position for 6 days, firing only when certain of hits, relocating after each engagement. They claimed 3 Sherman, tanks destroyed before American infantry located their cave and sealed it with explosives and flamethrowers. Another crew on Peleliu disabled 2 tanks in a single engagement, but ran out of armor-piercing ammunition. When American tanks approached their position the next day, they fired high-explosive rounds in desperation, achieving nothing before being killed by tank machine gun fire. A third crew, positioned to defend an airfield on Iwo Jima, watched American landing craft approach for 2 days but couldn't engage due to range limitations. When Marines landed and tanks came ashore, American naval gunfire had already destroyed their position. They never fired a shot. These men represented the forgotten casualties of technological inferiority. They trained hard, fought bravely, and died pointlessly, unable to meaningfully affect the outcome of battles they were doomed to lose. Their sacrifice was noble in human terms but strategically irrelevant. Japan had sent men to fight machines with inadequate tools and expected victory through spirit alone. The Type 1 story doesn't end in 1945. After the war, Indonesian forces obtained Japanese weapons left behind during the occupation. Type 1 guns saw action during the Indonesian National Revolution against Dutch and British forces. In the Battle of Surabaya, Type 1 guns engaged convoys that included M3 Stuart and M4 Sherman tanks. Reports indicate moderate casualties among Allied forces, suggesting the guns retained some effectiveness against lighter armour and in the confusion of urban combat. This extended service life demonstrated that the Type 1 wasn't inherently worthless. In appropriate tactical situations, against targets it was designed to engage, it could be effective. The problem was that by 1943, those appropriate situations barely existed in the Pacific War. The weapons Japan needed in 1945 were 75mm or larger anti-tank guns, produced in quantities of tens of thousands, with modern armor-piercing ammunition and the trucks to tow them, the fuel to move them, and the training to use them effectively. What Japan had was a couple thousand 47mm guns, inadequate ammunition, limited mobility, and increasingly desperate crews. The comparison with other nations is instructive. Germany fielded the Pat 40 75mm anti-tank gun in massive numbers. It could penetrate 89mm of armour at 500 metres, enough to threaten even heavy tanks. The United States deployed both towed 57mm guns and tank destroyers mounting 76mm and 90mm weapons. The Soviet Union produced over 400,000 anti-tank guns of various calibers during the war, ranging from 45mm to 100mm weapons. Japan's total production of dedicated anti-tank guns across all calibers was under 6,000 units. This wasn't just an industrial gap, it was an industrial chasm. Japan's steel production in 1944 was approximately 3 million tons. American steel production the same year exceeded 80 million tons. Japan couldn't build anti-tank guns in necessary quantities because it couldn't produce the steel. It couldn't produce the steel because Allied submarines had cut off imports of iron ore and coal. It couldn't protect shipping because it lacked sufficient destroyers and aircraft. It lacked sufficient destroyers and aircraft because steel and manufacturing capacity went to building battleships and carriers. The whole Japanese war economy was a cascade of impossible choices and inadequate resources. In the final analysis, the Type 1 47mm anti-tank gun represents a case study in how material factors dominate warfare. The gun itself was competently designed and reasonably well made. Japanese crews were brave, disciplined, and tactically skilled. Defensive positions were cleverly constructed and well camouflaged. None of it mattered. American industrial might, technological superiority, and logistical capability overwhelmed Japanese resistance through sheer weight of material. Every Japanese position eventually fell. Every gun was eventually destroyed or abandoned. Every crew eventually died or surrendered. The Type 1 couldn't stop Sherman tanks because stopping Sherman tanks required weapons, resources, and industrial capacity that Japan simply didn't possess. The myth of Japanese fighting spirit collided with the reality of American steel production, and steel won. War, at its most fundamental level, is applied industrial production. The side that can manufacture more weapons, supply more troops, and replace more losses will eventually prevail, assuming rough parity in leadership and fighting spirit. In the Pacific War, there was no parity in industrial capacity. The United States could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. This fact rendered Japanese tactical successes strategically meaningless. Today, preserved Type 1 guns can be seen in museums across the Pacific. At the Australian War Memorial, A Type 1 sits with faded olive paint and Japanese markings, its breech frozen open, a relic of a failed war. The placard notes it was captured on some forgotten island, used by some anonymous crew, now displayed as a curiosity. At the Yushukan Museum in Tokyo, another Type 1 is presented as an example of Japanese ingenuity and determination, the label emphasizing its technical sophistication and the bravery of its crews. Both interpretations contain truth. The gun was technically competent. The crews were brave, but the whole effort was futile from the start, an attempt to resist overwhelming force with insufficient means. The officers who developed the Type 1 knew it was inadequate even as they approved it for production. They hoped it would be good enough, that tactical skill and fighting spirit would compensate for technical shortcomings. They were wrong. The crews who fired the Type 1 in combat knew their weapons were insufficient. They fired anyway, doing their duty, hoping for small victories they knew wouldn't change the outcome. They died with that knowledge. The American tankers who faced Type 1 guns respected them as threats, but never feared them as equals. They knew that behind their armour, with their overwhelming fire support and endless replacements, they would eventually win every engagement. They were right. Looking back across 80 years, the Type 1 47mm anti-tank gun stands as a monument to a particular kind of tragedy. The tragedy of fighting well in a war already lost, of doing one's duty with inadequate tools, of facing inevitable defeat with courage that couldn't change the outcome. The approximately 2,300 Type 1 guns produced fought in dozens of battles across the Pacific. They destroyed a few hundred American tanks and armoured vehicles. They killed several thousand American soldiers and Marines. They delayed American advances by hours or days in various engagements. In the end, none of it mattered. The American advance continued. Japan lost every major battle from 1943 onward. The home islands were blockaded, bombed, and prepared for invasion until atomic weapons rendered that invasion unnecessary. The Type 1 guns, like the men who served them, and the nation that produced them, fought bravely and lost completely. That is the story of the Japanese Type 1 47mm anti-tank gun, a weapon that tried to stop American tanks and failed, not because of any lack of courage or skill in its use, but because industrial reality cannot be overcome by individual bravery, and wars between industrial nations are won in factories as much as on battlefields. Japan couldn't produce enough steel to win the war. Everything else was consequence. The Type 1 was a consequence. Its failure was inevitable from the moment it was conceived. Thousands of men died using it anyway, doing their duty to the end. That duty, that sacrifice, commands respect across the years, even as we recognize its futility. The Type 1 47mm anti-tank gun tried to stop American tanks. It failed. The tanks kept coming. The war ended. The guns were scrapped or preserved as museum pieces, silent witnesses to a war where industrial might proved stronger than fighting spirit, where steel mattered more than sacrifice, and where the side with more factories won over the side with more courage. That is the lesson of the Type 1. That is the lesson of the Pacific War. The deeper examination of the Type 1's combat performance reveals patterns that Japanese commanders recognized but could never solve. In the Philippines campaign of 1944 and 1945, Type 1 guns were deployed extensively in defense of Manila and other urban centers. The urban environment should have favored Japanese defensive tactics, with short engagement ranges and abundant cover for concealed gun positions. The reality proved otherwise. American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had learned from previous island campaigns. They employed combined arms tactics that systematically neutralized Japanese strongpoints. Tank infantry teams would advance with artillery and air support. When Type 1 guns opened fire, American forces would immediately suppress the position with overwhelming firepower while maneuvering to flank it. The gun's low rate of sustained fire, typically 10 to 15 rounds per minute in actual combat conditions compared to theoretical maximum rates, meant they couldn't engage multiple targets simultaneously. A single gun position might disable one Sherman, but would then be destroyed by the other 3 tanks in the platoon before it could reload and engage again. In one documented engagement during the Battle of Manila in February 1945, a Type 1 gun position in the Intramuros district managed a near-perfect ambush. The gun crew had waited as a column of 4 Sherman tanks from the 44th Tank Battalion entered a narrow street. At 80 meters range, they fired at the lead tank's side armor, penetrating cleanly and setting it ablaze. The crew immediately traversed to engage the second tank, firing twice and achieving one penetrating hit. But the third and fourth Shermans had already identified the gun position by its muzzle flash. Both tanks fired high explosive rounds into the building where the gun was positioned. The entire structure collapsed, killing the gun crew and burying the weapon. Total engagement time was less than 90 seconds. This pattern repeated across hundreds of engagements. Japanese gun crews would achieve initial success, then be overwhelmed by coordinated American response. The fundamental problem was that American doctrine assumed casualties and planned for them. Japanese doctrine assumed sacrifice but couldn't replace losses. The ammunition situation for the Type 1 became increasingly desperate as the war progressed. Each gun required a variety of ammunition types for different targets. The Type 1 armor-piercing high-explosive round was the primary anti-tank munition, but high-explosive rounds were needed for infantry and soft targets. Shrapnel rounds were useful for anti-personnel work. Smoke rounds were valuable for screening maneuvers. By 1944, Japanese industry could barely produce sufficient armor-piercing ammunition. Quality control suffered as experienced workers were conscripted and replaced with unskilled labor. Captured Japanese ammunition examined by American ordnance experts showed increasing defects. Shell casings had uneven thickness. Propellant charges varied in weight and composition. Armor-piercing caps were improperly hardened and sometimes shattered on impact rather than penetrating. The fuses were unreliable, with high-explosive rounds sometimes detonating prematurely or failing to detonate at all. One batch of ammunition captured on Iwo Jima was tested by American technicians. Out of 50 armor-piercing rounds, 12 failed to fire due to defective primers. Of the 38 that did fire, 7 had armor-piercing caps that shattered on impact with test armor plate. The effective failure rate was 38%. Japanese gun crews couldn't afford such failure rates. With limited ammunition stocks and no possibility of resupply, every round had to count. But even when ammunition functioned perfectly, the fundamental problem remained. The penetration values were marginal against Sherman armor at practical combat ranges. Gun crews needed to achieve near-perfect hits on vulnerable areas to ensure kills. Under combat stress, with limited training ammunition for practice, and facing return fire from multiple weapons, such precision was nearly impossible to achieve consistently. American after-action reports contain numerous instances of Sherman tanks being hit multiple times by Japanese anti-tank guns without being penetrated or disabled. One Sherman on Peleliu was hit 7 times by what was identified as a 47mm weapon, probably a Type 1. All 7 rounds struck the frontal armor at angles that prevented penetration. The tank continued operating and eventually destroyed the gun position with high explosive fire. The crew reported they hadn't even realized they were taking anti-tank fire until they saw the impact marks during post-battle inspection. This was the ultimate indictment of the Type 1's inadequacy. Japanese gun crews were firing at American tanks, achieving hits, and the tanks weren't even aware they were under attack. The training regime for Type 1 gun crews deteriorated as the war progressed, compounding the weapon's inherent limitations. In 1942 and early 1943, gun crews received several months of training, including live-fire exercises with full ammunition allowances. By 1944, training was reduced to weeks with minimal live-fire practice due to ammunition shortages. Crews would practice loading drills with dummy rounds, learn to estimate ranges without actually firing, and study tank recognition from photographs and models. When these poorly trained crews faced combat, the results were predictable. Engagement ranges were misjudged, rounds were wasted on targets that were out of effective range, or at angles where penetration was impossible. Gun crews panicked under fire and abandoned positions prematurely, or conversely stayed too long, and were killed before achieving meaningful results. One Japanese officer's diary, recovered on Okinawa, described the training situation with brutal honesty. He wrote in March 1945 that his battery of 4 Type 1 guns had received only 20 rounds of live ammunition for training over a 3-month period. Each gun crew had fired exactly 5 rounds before being declared combat ready. The officer noted that 5 rounds were insufficient to master the weapon, understand its ballistics, or develop the coordination necessary for effective crew operation. He predicted his unit would achieve minimal results in combat, and that most crews would be killed in their first engagement. His predictions proved accurate. The battery engaged American tanks on April 14, 1945, One gun never fired, its crew killed by artillery before engaging. 2 guns fired multiple rounds without achieving penetrations and were destroyed by return fire. The 4th gun achieved 1 mobility kill by striking a Sherman's track, but the immobilized tank continued firing and destroyed the gun position within minutes. 4 guns, 20 men, eliminated in exchange for 1 temporarily disabled tank that was repaired and returned to service within hours. This exchange ratio characterized Japanese anti-tank operations throughout 1945. The Type 1 crews were brave and determined, but lacked the training, ammunition, and fundamentally the weapons necessary to meaningfully resist American armor. The logistics of operating Type 1 guns in the Pacific environment created additional challenges. The pneumatic tires that provided good mobility on roads were vulnerable to punctures from coral, volcanic rock, and jungle debris common on Pacific islands. Crews often had to remove the wheels and manhandle guns into position using improvised methods. The gun weighed 753 kilograms, manageable for a full crew, but extremely difficult for the reduced-strength units common by 1944. The optical sights required careful maintenance and calibration. In the humid, salt-air environment of tropical islands, lenses fogged, reticles corroded, and mechanisms jammed. Gun crews were supposed to clean and maintain sights daily, but in combat conditions this was often impossible. Many engagements were fought with degraded sights that made accurate range estimation and aiming difficult. The semi-automatic breech mechanism, while sophisticated, required regular maintenance and lubrication. The sliding wedge needed to be kept clean and properly lubricated to function reliably. In defensive positions under constant bombardment, with limited access to proper lubricants and cleaning materials, mechanisms degraded. Some guns reverted to manual operation when the automatic function failed, significantly reducing rate of fire. The recoil system used hydraulic dampers that required specific maintenance. Leaking seals or damaged cylinders would cause erratic recoil behavior, throwing off accuracy and potentially damaging the carriage. Spare parts were scarce to non-existent by 1945. A gun with a damaged recoil system was effectively useless but had to remain in position because no replacement was available. American forces occasionally captured intact Type 1 guns and attempted to use them. Reports indicate the guns functioned adequately when properly maintained and supplied with quality ammunition. American ordnance teams concluded the weapon was reasonably well designed, but noted it was too light for modern anti-tank work. The consensus was that as a battalion anti-tank gun for infantry support, it was adequate for its intended role. The problem was that its intended role, defeating light and medium tanks from the late 1930s, was obsolete by 1943. The psychological impact on Japanese gun crews deserves examination. These men knew they were operating inferior weapons against superior forces. They knew their chances of survival were minimal. They knew that even if they achieved some success, it wouldn't change the war's outcome. Yet they fought anyway, driven by duty, loyalty, and the military culture that demanded absolute obedience and self-sacrifice. Interviews with Japanese POWs who had served in anti-tank units reveal complex attitudes. Many expressed pride in their technical skills and their willingness to fight against overwhelming odds. They believed their sacrifice, while militarily ineffective, upheld Japanese honor and the warrior tradition. Others expressed bitterness at being asked to fight with inadequate weapons. One former gun commander captured on Okinawa stated in interrogation that he and his men had been sent to die uselessly, that their officers knew the Type 1 couldn't stop Sherman tanks, but ordered them to fight anyway for propaganda purposes rather than military necessity. He described watching American tanks shrug off hit after hit, while his position was systematically destroyed by return fire. He stated that the only reason he survived was that he had been knocked unconscious by a near miss, and was presumed dead by his crew when they died at their gun. When he regained consciousness, the battle had moved on, and he surrendered to American infantry rather than attempt suicidal resistance. His account suggests that at least some Japanese soldiers recognized the futility of their situation and the criminal negligence of commanders who ordered impossible missions with inadequate means. The famous Japanese fighting spirit, the willingness to die rather than surrender, was real but not universal. Many Japanese soldiers fought to the death because surrender was culturally unacceptable, and because they had been told Americans would torture and kill prisoners. When those few who did surrender discovered they would be treated humanely, Some provided detailed information about Japanese defensive plans, unit strengths, and weapon capabilities. The intelligence gathered from these sources helped American forces develop more effective tactics against Japanese strongpoints, including Type 1 gun positions. The comparison between Japanese and American anti-tank doctrine illuminates fundamental differences in military philosophy. American doctrine emphasized flexibility, combined arms coordination, and overwhelming firepower. When American units encountered strong resistance, they would call for artillery support, airstrikes, naval gunfire, or additional armor. The response would arrive within minutes to hours. Resources were abundant, and commanders were encouraged to use them liberally to minimize friendly casualties. Japanese doctrine emphasized individual initiative, improvisation in the face of scarcity, and acceptance of heavy casualties in pursuit of objectives. Japanese units facing superior enemy forces were expected to fight with available resources until destroyed. Retreat was shameful, requesting support was admission of weakness, and survival was less important than inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy. These doctrinal differences meant that even when Japanese and American units possessed comparable weapons, outcomes favored the Americans. Japanese gun crews would fight until killed or their weapons were destroyed. American tank crews would withdraw when faced with serious anti-tank threats, call for artillery to suppress the position, then advance after the threat was neutralized. The Japanese approach was tactically brave but strategically bankrupt. Losing gun crews and weapons achieved nothing if replacement wasn't possible. The American approach preserved forces and used material superiority to overcome resistance. One American tank officer, interviewed after the war, described the difference succinctly. He said that Japanese anti-tank gunners were individually brave and occasionally skilled, but they fought as if each battle was the only battle. American forces fought as if each battle was one among thousands, because for them it was. Losing a tank meant requisitioning a replacement. Losing a crew meant rotating in replacements from training units. For the Japanese, losing a gun or crew meant permanent reduction in combat capability. This fundamental asymmetry meant the outcome was never in doubt once American forces established logistical superiority. The technical evolution of the Type 1 during its service life was minimal, reflecting Japan's inability to improve weapon systems during wartime. While German anti-tank guns progressed from 37mm to 50mm to 75mm to 88mm weapons, with constant improvements in ammunition and fire control, the Type 1 remained essentially unchanged from 1942 to 1945. Some late production guns had minor modifications to simplify manufacturing, substituting stamped parts for machined components and reducing finish quality to speed production. These changes, if anything, reduced weapon quality rather than improving it. The ammunition showed similar stagnation. While German armor-piercing rounds progressed from simple shot to capped shot to tungsten-core sub-caliber projectiles with increasingly sophisticated ballistics, Japanese armor-piercing ammunition remained essentially the Type 1 APHE round throughout the war. Tungsten was scarce in Japan, reserved for machine tools and aircraft engine components rather than ammunition. The shape charge technology that might have allowed smaller caliber weapons to defeat heavier armor was developed in Japan but never successfully applied to anti-tank ammunition in significant quantities. A few experimental rounds were produced but never issued in quantity to combat units. This technological stagnation meant that while American tank armor improved, with the introduction of Sherman variants with thicker armor and better protection, the Type 1's ability to defeat that armor actually decreased over time. A gun that was marginal against early Sherman models in 1943 was nearly useless against late-war Sherman variants with additional armor plates and improved protection in 1945. The final variant of the Sherman used in the Pacific, the M4A3, had welded hull construction that was more resistant to penetration than earlier cast hull variants. The frontal hull armor remained 50.8mm, but the improved construction techniques and better armor quality meant the effective protection was even higher. Type 1 crews facing these later Shermans found their already inadequate weapons even less effective. The broader strategic context reveals that the Type 1's failure was symptomatic of Japan's overall military-industrial failure. Japan entered the war with the industrial capacity of a minor power, trying to fight a war against major industrial powers. The decision to attack the United States while already bogged down in China and facing the Soviet Union in Manchuria was strategic insanity enabled by a military culture that valued spiritual strength over material calculation. The Type 1 program, initiated after Nomonhan, represented an attempt to address recognized deficiencies in anti-tank capabilities. But the response was inadequate from conception. Rather than developing a weapon capable of defeating current and projected armor threats, Japan developed a weapon that was marginal against current threats and would inevitably be obsolete against future developments. This pattern repeated across Japanese weapons programs. The Zero fighter was exceptional in 1941 but obsolete by 1943, with no adequate replacement. Japanese submarines were technologically sophisticated but used for fleet support rather than commerce raiding, failing to interdict American supply lines. Japanese battleships were magnificent but strategically irrelevant, consuming resources that could have been better used for destroyers, transports, and merchant shipping. The Type 1 anti-tank gun was another example of this pattern. It was a competent weapon for the wrong war, produced in insufficient quantities, supplied with inadequate ammunition, and employed in a losing cause. The approximately 2,300 guns produced represent thousands of tons of steel, tens of thousands of man-hours of skilled labor, and resources that could have been used for other purposes. If those resources had been used to produce more trucks, more radios, more ammunition for existing weapons, would Japanese forces have been more effective? Almost certainly yes. The Type 1 provided minimal capability in a role where Japanese forces were hopelessly overmatched. Better logistics and communications would have improved performance across all roles, but Japanese military culture emphasized offensive weapons and combat systems over the unglamorous logistics that modern warfare required. The few tactical successes achieved by Type 1 guns deserve examination as they illuminate what might have been possible with better resources. On Peleliu, a single Type 1 gun position held up the American advance for an entire day. The gun was positioned in a coral cave with an extremely restricted field of fire covering a single approach. The crew had excellent concealment, overhead protection from artillery, and carefully measured range markers for accurate fire. When American tanks advanced, the gun crew waited until the lead tank was at exactly 150 meters range, presenting a perfect side shot. They fired 3 rounds in rapid succession, achieving 2 penetrations that disabled the tank and killed 3 crew members. The remaining tanks withdrew, while infantry attempted to locate and suppress the gun position. The gun crew relocated to an alternate position within the same cave complex, a pre-planned move that allowed them to continue engaging without being destroyed by counterfire. Over the next several hours, the gun engaged 2 more tanks, achieving 1 additional mobility kill before American forces finally located the position and destroyed it with flamethrowers and demolition charges. This engagement represented near-perfect employment of the Type 1. Excellent positioning, disciplined fire control, pre-planned alternate positions, and crew skill combined to achieve maximum effect with limited resources. 2 American tanks were destroyed, 1 was immobilized, and the advance was delayed by a full day. If Japan had possessed 20,000 such gun positions with equally skilled crews and unlimited ammunition, the outcome of the Pacific War might have been different. But Japan didn't have 20,000 excellent positions. It had a few thousand positions ranging from excellent to terrible, with most being merely adequate. Japan didn't have unlimited ammunition. It had barely sufficient ammunition for expected operations with no reserves for extended engagements. Japan didn't have thousands of expertly trained crews. It had a few hundred experienced crews and several thousand poorly trained crews thrown into combat with minimal preparation. The Peleliu engagement represented the absolute maximum potential of the Type 1 under ideal conditions. It achieved modest tactical success at the cost of the entire crew and the weapon. Repeated across thousands of engagements, this exchange rate guaranteed defeat. The role of American intelligence in countering the Type 1 threat illustrates how technological and intelligence advantages compounded on the battlefield. American forces captured Type 1 guns, technical manuals, and ammunition relatively early in the Pacific Campaign. Technical intelligence teams dissected the weapons, tested them against Sherman armor at various ranges and angles, and distributed detailed reports to frontline units. Tank crews were briefed on the Type 1's capabilities and limitations. They were told the gun couldn't penetrate frontal armor at typical combat ranges. They were warned that side and rear armor were vulnerable, requiring careful tactics to minimize exposure. they were informed about typical Japanese employment, including camouflage positions, ambush tactics, and the likelihood of multiple guns covering critical approaches. This information allowed American crews to operate with confidence, knowing the limits of enemy capabilities. Japanese gun crews, by contrast, had minimal intelligence about American armour. Technical manuals for Sherman tanks, if they existed in Japanese hands, were rare and not widely distributed. Gun crews often had only rough estimates of Sherman armour thickness, and no detailed information about vulnerable spots. They were told to aim for sides and rear, but had little specific guidance about optimal aim points. The intelligence asymmetry meant American crews could take calculated risks while Japanese crews operated largely on hope and luck. An American tank commander, knowing his frontal armour was proof against Type 1 fire, could advance confidently while using terrain to protect his vulnerable sides. A Japanese gun commander, uncertain whether his weapon could penetrate American armour, had to make decisions based on incomplete information and often guessed wrong about engagement ranges and aim points. This intelligence advantage, combined with material superiority, made American victory almost inevitable in any given engagement. The environmental challenges of Pacific Island warfare affected Type 1 performance in ways that designers never anticipated. On volcanic islands like Iwo Jima, the abrasive volcanic ash infiltrated every mechanism. Gun crews reported that after even brief exposure to wind-blown ash, breech mechanisms became gritty and stiff. Optical sights became scratched and degraded. Moving parts required constant cleaning that was impossible under combat conditions. On coral islands like Tarawa and Peleliu, the coral dust had similar effects. The dust was extremely fine and infiltrated sealed mechanisms through microscopic gaps. It mixed with lubricants to form an abrasive paste that accelerated wear on moving parts. Gun crews attempted to protect weapons by wrapping mechanisms in cloth or oiled paper, but these expedients were only marginally effective. In jungle environments like New Guinea and the Philippines, humidity and vegetation created different problems. Metal parts corroded despite protective coatings. Mold grew on leather seats and canvas covers. Insects built nests in barrels and mechanisms. Rust formed on shells, potentially causing jams or misfires. The bamboo and hardwood used for camouflage attracted termites that could undermine entire positions. American weapons faced similar environmental challenges but had significant advantages. American industrial capacity provided abundant spare parts, lubricants, and maintenance equipment. American logistics delivered these supplies reliably to frontline units. American maintenance personnel were trained to deal with environmental damage and could often repair or replace damaged components quickly. Japanese forces had limited spare parts, inadequate lubricants, and minimal maintenance infrastructure. A Type 1 gun with a degraded breech mechanism or corroded barrel remained in service because no replacement was available. The weapon's effectiveness deteriorated, but it remained the only anti-tank capability available, so it was retained in position despite its declining performance. By 1945, some Type 1 guns in service were essentially non-functional, retained in positions because abandoning them would admit the complete collapse of Japanese defensive capabilities. Gun crews would maintain their positions, aware their weapons might not function, but unwilling to abandon their posts. When American forces overran these positions, they sometimes found guns that hadn't fired a shot because they were physically incapable of firing. The human stories behind the statistics provide context for the broader failure. Private First Class Kenji Tanaka served on a Type 1 gun crew on Okinawa. His diary, recovered after his death, provides insight into the experience of Japanese anti-tank gunners. Tanaka had been a university student studying engineering before conscription. He was trained as a gunner and assigned to the 32nd Army. His diary entries from March and April 1945 described the experience of waiting for the American invasion. He wrote about the intensive preparation, digging gun positions and stockpiling ammunition. He described his crew, 4 men including himself and their commander, a sergeant with combat experience in China. He noted that their Type 1 gun was relatively new and functioned well during practice drills, though they had only 30 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition and 20 high-explosive rounds for combat. As the American invasion began, Tanaka's entries became more sporadic and stressed. He described the overwhelming American bombardment, the constant presence of aircraft, and the realization that Japanese forces were completely outmatched. On April 19th, his crew engaged American tanks for the first time. His entry, written that evening, described firing 6 rounds at 2 Sherman tanks. They achieved one hit that appeared to penetrate, causing smoke to rise from the target. The other tank immediately returned fire and American artillery followed within minutes. One crew member was killed by shell fragments, and the gun was damaged by a near miss. They had relocated to an alternate position by nightfall. Tanaka's final entry, dated April 23rd, described his crew's situation as hopeless. They had 11 armor-piercing rounds remaining, their gun's optical sight was damaged, and they were down to 3 men including himself. He wrote that they had been ordered to fight to the death and would obey orders, but he questioned whether their deaths would serve any purpose. The entry ended mid-sentence. Tanaka's body was found at his gun position by American forces in May. The gun had been destroyed by a direct hit, likely from a tank round. The remaining ammunition was still stacked nearby, unused. His story, multiplied across thousands of similar gun positions, illustrates the human cost of Japan's strategic and material failures. The final months of the war saw Type 1 guns relegated to homeland defense, positioned to resist the anticipated American invasion of Japan. Thousands of guns were emplaced along likely invasion beaches, in prepared positions that would have maximized their limited effectiveness. Gun crews, often consisting of older reservists and young conscripts, trained with these weapons knowing they would likely be fighting on Japanese soil against overwhelming forces. The Japanese plan for homeland defense, Operation Ketsugo, relied heavily on anti-tank defenses including Type 1 guns. The plan anticipated that American forces would suffer heavy casualties during initial landings, and that determined resistance might convince the United States to negotiate rather than conquer all of Japan. This plan was delusional, but reflected the desperate strategic situation Japan faced by mid-1945. The Type 1 guns positioned for homeland defense never fired in anger. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with Soviet entry into the war, convinced Japanese leadership to surrender before invasion became necessary. The thousands of gun crews prepared to die defending their homeland were instead demobilized and sent home. After surrender, Allied occupation forces collected and destroyed thousands of Japanese weapons, including Type 1 guns. Some were preserved for technical intelligence and museum display. Most were scrapped, their steel recycled for peaceful purposes. The gun crews who had trained to use them transitioned to civilian life, carrying memories of preparation for a battle that never came. In retrospect, the Type 1's obsolescence for homeland defense was even more pronounced than in Pacific Island battles. Allied planners anticipated using massive air and naval bombardment before landings, supported by tens of thousands of tanks and overwhelming air superiority. Japanese anti-tank defenses, including Type 1 guns, would have faced not hundreds, but thousands of tanks supported by unprecedented firepower. The exchange rates that rendered Type 1 guns marginally effective in Pacific Island battles would have been catastrophically inadequate in homeland defense. Japan might have achieved higher absolute numbers of American casualties, but the ultimate outcome would have been identical. American industrial might would have ground through Japanese defenses until resistance collapsed. The Type 1 gun, like every other Japanese weapon, would have proven insufficient against the overwhelming material superiority of American forces. The atomic bomb spared both Japanese gun crews and American tankers from discovering just how one-sided that battle would have been.